Hello, BookTube. Last Sunday, I tried something new. It can go disastrously wrong on this channel. Last Sunday, I got the New York Times, the Sunday edition, the big block Sunday New York Times, and I made myself some breakfast, and I settled Frida, and I settled in my big easy chair, and gave myself the wonderful indulgence of just reading through it. No phone, no iPad, no nothing. Just reading through the New York Times on Sunday. And when I was done, in fact, an hour after I was done, I thought, you should share this with your imaginary BookTube friends. The book review, anyway, because the heart of the Sunday New York Times is the pull-out book review section, which is the pinnacle of my profession. That is the most influential, the most read book review site, organ that there is for serious reviewers. It's the thing, or maybe not. Maybe Goodreads has superseded it. But for every generation before Goodreads, for everybody who remembers a time before the internet, the Sunday New York Times was the thing. It was the thing. It could make or break your career. It even to this day, publishers will pay some of their authors. Some publishers will pay some of their authors bonuses for how long they're on the Sunday New York Times, the bestseller list. There's extra money there, and there's also renown. There are plenty of readers in the world, even now in the 21st century, in the world of the internet. There are plenty of readers who rely on the Sunday New York Times religiously. So I thought at least go through that, and I got a lot of emails. I got a lot of comments about it. A lot of the comments on that video were echoing the emails that I got and saying, we'd very much like you to keep doing this, to do this every Sunday. A lot of the emails that I got were a lot more hardcore. A lot of you are quite hardcore. Quite a few people saying, why are you only taking us through the book review? Why don't you take us through the whole of the Sunday New York Times? That would take 2 hours. And another thing that people noticed about the first book review that we did last week is something that I hadn't noticed until the video was over, which is that there was no direct involvement by me. Not in the sense of me having a review in the New York Times book review. That is never going to happen. They can meet only one of my 3 conditions. So that is, I don't think they would want me anyway. I'm not their kind of reviewer. But no, not in the sense of me being in the review, but in the sense of me being involved critically with some of the books in the review. It was almost a clean sweep. I had read a lot of the books, but I hadn't actually reviewed any of them myself. And that's rare for any review, whether it's the London Review or the TLS or whatever. There's always some sort of intersection, and usually, and there wasn't this time, but there is now. There is in this week's review, so that'll be something anyway. But before we get to the book review, I thought once again we would dip into the Sunday review section, which is basically the op-ed section for the Sunday paper. That has all sorts of longer think pieces of all kinds and varieties. Last time there was a long article on dogs, so I had to talk about that. This time around, there were a couple of things that caught my attention. The first one you will have seen linked and talked about on social media. It was circulating long before the Sunday Times came out. It's a long opinion by Chris Hughes, who was the co-founder of Facebook. And it says it's time for the government to break up Facebook. It's time for the government to apply antitrust laws to Facebook and break it up. And I resisted. I knew that it was going to be in the Sunday paper. So I resisted. It's a huge, huge article. It goes on for page after page. And I resisted reading the linked versions online because I wanted to sit down with it on Sunday and read it, myself. And I was amazed by it. I was struck by it. It is such an incredibly disingenuous piece of writing. There are personal elements, positive and negative, ruining and tangling the argument on every level of what is a very long piece. It's probably 6,000 words of prose. And there are personal elements, positive and negative. He stresses a number of different points in this op-ed that he knows Mark Zuckerberg personally, that he's hugged his wife, that he's watched his children play and visited his home in a leafy suburb and whatnot, and remembers the good old days when they were forming Facebook together. There's a picture of them when they were golden youths. And on the one hand, that seems so queasy and obsequious. On the other hand, equally evident throughout the piece, to me anyway, was sour grapes of a massive kind. I wasn't 10 paragraphs into this piece before I didn't believe a word he was saying about the practical, ethical, moral, and financial reasons why he was laying out that Facebook should be broken up into component parts. After 10 paragraphs, I didn't believe a word of what he was saying. That's all struck me as, I don't know, for want of a better word, a massive hit piece. I mean, I would certainly agree that Facebook is too powerful. I think that goes without saying. It's ridiculous. Facebook rules whole countries. It is the internet for whole countries, and totally Orwellian style determines what they do and do not know about the outside world. No company should have that much power. None of them should. But I myself, I mean, I don't think that Chris Hughes, deep in his heart, really does think that the government stepping in and breaking Facebook apart is the right approach. I don't think he really thinks that. I think if he himself were CEO right now of a company as big as Facebook, he would be going to the antitrust commissioners and saying, my company's just too big, I'm afraid you have to step in. He would view that as a horrible overreach of federal power. I think what he's really thinking, well, one way or another, I myself would prefer it if instead of the government stepping in, the market took care of it. I myself would prefer, I mean, Facebook has had so much bad press in the last 2 years. And that's only going to get worse as more and more becomes known, as more and more people slip the tether and start telling on Facebook. There's going to be a greater and greater stink to it. I don't know anybody under the age of 30 who uses Facebook regularly anymore. And that is the solution that I prefer. Rather than the government coming in and saying, you're too powerful, we need to break you up, I would prefer it if the government, first of all, would exercise the same oversight rules that it already has on the books. It doesn't do that with Facebook. They're contemplating a fine for Facebook. I forget what the number was, but I remember a friend of mine telling me, okay, whatever that number is, I don't remember what the number is for the proposed fine, but he said, that fine for Facebook is this. That long. That's the amount of money that they make in that much space. The space where I was quiet. That's their fine. Of a whole day, of a whole hour, of a whole year, that space where I was quiet, that is their fine. So it's nothing. Literally nothing. And the government could do a lot more than that without overreaching. But really, it'll be people leaving Facebook that will do it. I would like to see, if Facebook is too big, too powerful, too evil, too gross, to use the term that one young friend of mine uses for it religiously, then Facebook should suffer the MySpace fate. Have the market leave it, and that'll be that. But one way or another, I urge you, if you see the piece linked online, you should read it and see what you think of it yourself. But it was irritating me, and I was thinking, okay, the op-ed section of the New York Times can't irritate me anymore. This is the worst emotional reaction that it's going to get. But I was wrong. This article is about Bella Coola Valley in Canada. And it starts off with, one of the first things Stephen Hodgson noticed was Jordan Carberry's slippers lying side by side on the path, as if he'd just stepped out of them. Then he spotted a bloody chunk of his scalp and half his right ear. Mr. Hodgson, a provincial conservation officer whose duties include dealing with problem animals, was at the scene of a harrowing grizzly bear attack that took place just steps from the front door of Mr. Carberry's home. In the past, the mauling would have meant the automatic death sentence for the sow and her cubs. But in Bella Coola Valley on Canada's west coast, where precipitous mountains plunge down to its namesake Salmon River, and where people have cleared land in the rainforest to grow lush gardens, the lines that have long divided two apex predators, bears and humans, have blurred. Except for this one morning, those lines were perfectly clear. Mr. Hodgson, who arrived within an hour of the attack, came with an open mind and took in the scene. The scuff marks where the grizzly dug her enormous paws into the ground as she accelerated, the blood splatters around the body parts, the camera lying in the dirt. Mr. Carberry, a park ranger, had stepped outside his home at sunrise last July 3rd to take photos of bears foraging in a cherry tree. Then he spotted their mother charging him, the fur on the hump of her shoulder bristling in alarm, and he made his second mistake of the day. He ran. She had him in a moment. The bear toppled him by raking her claws across the back of his legs. She grabbed his skull in her jaws, lifting and dropping him. He kicked at her head, punched her, and scrambled into the house. And the whole article is about efforts on humans' part to peacefully cohabit with grizzly bears. So I was happy to move on to the book review. And the book review was, in this case, did have some intersections with me, starting with the book on the front cover of the book review. That is always a signal honor. It's a signal attention getter who in the to and fro and the conversations of the editorial team, what book, what review is going to get on the cover of the book review. And this time around, I am amazed. I did not think this book was going to get the press that it has. No one has turned down reviewing it. No one has. And it's Our Man, by George Packer. It's a black and white photo of the subject of the biography. It's a biography of Richard Holbrooke, who was in the State Department forever and ever, and who badly wanted to be Secretary of State and never quite became it. I mean, Holbrooke was in the State Department, but he was never Secretary of State. You'd think that would mean he would never have a full-length biography. He's had at least 2 that I know of, and both were really good. And Packer's book is amazing, just amazing. Didn't know what to make of it. It is so hyperbolic. It is so Hemingway-esque. I didn't know what to make of it, but it has stuck with me. What an accomplishment. So I guess I maybe shouldn't be surprised. You know, you're a book editor at the New York Times. You get this book. You've heard a little about it. Maybe you've seen that Kirkus or Library Journal has already praised it. You know that it's contemporary American history, and that it's a biography. You have a list of people that you would like to match that book with. And you don't decide. Instead, you send it to them. Would you look this over? Is this anything? So I maybe shouldn't be surprised, because these people would have had the same reaction I did. I got the book and thought, okay, a long book about Dick Holbrooke? I mean, okay, all right. And then I read it. Then I even started to read it. Even 10 pages in, you know right away, this is not an ordinary biography, and you're not going to be able to stop. So I shouldn't be surprised that other people would have that same reaction. And in this case, the other person is Walter Isaacson, the great biographer, who, among others, I wrote a great biography of Steve Jobs. And he has a wonderful review. It is very long. The front page book review in the book review jumps. It goes from the front page to inside the review. So it's very long, and it's very good. It's a glowing review, of course. I don't see how it couldn't be. It's not, of course, because it's a big release and there's all sorts of money involved. It's of course, because this is the kind of book that if somebody starts to read it, they're going to want to write about it, and they're going to want to praise it, even while they're condemning its subject, because Holbrooke was an egomaniac. There's a good reason. There's a very good reason. I mean, George Packer was a friend, an acolyte of Holbrooke, and he acknowledges that himself. But the main reason why Holbrooke never became Secretary of State is because no one trusted him with that much power. No one wanted to. 2 very different presidents did not want to trust him with that much power. But we'll get to that. I want to read you some choice bits from that once we get to the jump part. But first, the letters. The New York Times, the Sunday New York Times Book Review always prints letters, and there's one in here that's just a gem. I just have to read it. There's one that isn't. There's one where I just completely agree. It's Margaret Jones writing from Indianapolis, and she writes, "I wish Robert Caro had used the time he spent on working his new memoir, on his biography of Lyndon Johnson. Neither he nor I is getting any younger. At 76, I've about given up on living long enough to read the final volume." She speaks for many, many readers when she writes that simple sentence. So I agreed completely. There's another letter here. There was let's see here. Yes, there was a review of Mary Norris's book, Greek to Me, The Adventures of a Comma Queen. And a writer writes in and says, in her review of Mary Norris's book, Vivian Gornick paraphrases Isaiah Berlin's distinction between the hedgehog and the fox this way. The former is, quote, a person who works to know one thing completely, while the latter, quote, pursues many things superficially. Which is entirely true. That is an entirely true summary of Isaiah Berlin's distinction between the fox and the hedgehog. The writer goes on. Might this dichotomy be better expressed as, quote, the hedgehog burrows in on one thing obsessively, the fox desires to know many things compulsively? And the answer to that rhetorical question is no. No, that it might not be better put that way. The way you've put it is only preferable if you want to sound like, to quote Peter O'Toole in Masada, the god of all fatuous idiots. But there's always a chuckle like that in the letters page. And then we have the Buy the Book section. This will be popular to a lot of people on BookTube. And this time around, it's Admiral William McRaven, who just gets their standard formulaic questions that have been bashed so much by eggheads that don't think this is a waste of time and waste of space. You're asking someone which three authors they'd invite to dinner. I'm interested in that. I think a lot of people are interested in that. I don't begrudge it at all. And his new book, Sea Stories, is really, really good. It's really good. But then we have, we'll go through the reviews. They review Beeline, the life and the world of children's spelling bees. Someone named Alex Kuzinski reviews Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb. He does a fairly good job. He spends his first 3 paragraphs on anecdotes about himself in therapy to sort of lay the groundwork. I'm sure because he thought, well, it's a book about therapy. It's a book about a therapist going to a therapist, so I'm allowed. And the anecdotes are fairly well done, but I was reading this review in the New York Times Book Review on Sunday, and all I could think about was the review of this same book. Maybe You Should Talk to Someone that Olive did on a book Olive. If I remember, I'll leave a link to her review down below. But it was in every functional sense better than this review in the New York Times Book Review, which I won't harp on this because we have the whole rest of the book review to get to. But I see things in videos like that. I see things that maybe are glimpses of the future. And I love it. I love what I see. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love the totally informal, chatty nature of BookTube. Of course I do. That's what I got into it for, and I've had so much fun with that element of BookTube. But at the same time, there is an uncomfortable gap between the world of BookTube that I experience. I am a booktuber, I wouldn't pass it up for the world, and the world of formal book reviewing, which I also know. There's a rather large and uncomfortable gap between those two, to the point where there are many, many BookTube channels that I absolutely love that I wouldn't even show to a semi-professional book reviewer or a book section editor. I wouldn't know what I would need to sit there and explain BookTube to them because they would be looking for a book review or a book discussion, some kind or other, and they wouldn't be getting that. Instead, they'd be getting what we do on BookTube so well, which is, books as a part of our lives. I love that. I love that so much. But there's a way for that to be made to cross that gap. Olive did it perfectly. And I see other channels that do it as well, and better than this review. So, I wonder what that future will be. A future where, I don't know. The New York Times Book Review has a podcast. They, as far as I know, don't have a YouTube channel. Anyway. Then there's a review by Michelle Goldberg, who writes for the Times, of a book called The Death and Life of Ida Hernandez that I didn't read and don't know. But the reviews in the middle, some of them bugged me a bit. There's a phenomenon of the Times likes to match books with reviewers, and the metric by which they consider whether or not a match is good has changed over time. And now in the 21st century, in the era of own voices and Me Too and whatnot, a lot of that metric, I think, goes towards virtue signaling in a way that is not healthy for the main point of a book review, which is you. You are the main point of a book review, not the bragging rights for the New York Times. But like, for instance, a reviewer named Chris Lee reviews Miracle Creek by Angie Kim, which is a debut novel that I really liked. And the review is very positive. But it starts off with, in this thought-provoking journey of ideas disguised as a courtroom page-turner, Pak and Young Yu, recently arrived from South Korea, want nothing more than better education and a future for their teenage daughter Mary. But the little attached bio note for Chris Lee is Chris Lee's most recent book is How I Became North Korean. And I know that that is not a coincidence. Of course it's not. That was the metric. That was on the mind of whoever assigned this review. Was, I got a debut novel by a Korean author about Koreans. I better get a Korean reviewer, so that we're not accused of cultural appropriation or imperialism or any other nonsense like that. I'm sure was the mind frame, but what does that do for the review? It immediately makes you distrust it. I mean, first of all, it's not to hammer this point too hard, but first of all, thinking like that is openly racist. But leaving that point aside, it also introduces into any reader, most readers of this book, just like most readers of this review, will not be Korean. What are they going to think? You were chosen because you share a nationality with the author? There's a strong likelihood that is partly true. And in any reader, that's going to introduce an element of doubt. Well, okay. Do you feel an inherent sympathy for this author that maybe will soften or warp your critical judgment? If this same debut novel were sucked out of its covers now, sucked out of its biography now, and poured into the biography of a white man from Appalachia, would you have been harder on it? Does it have flaws that you are intentionally overlooking out of a sense of sympathy? Which is exactly the sort of thing that is introduced when you do this kind of pandering. That kind of doubt is introduced the minute you do something like that, and it drives me crazy. Like, for instance, it happens again. Just one page over, this middle page, all three reviews raise questions like that. Someone named Amelia Lester reviews Boy Swallows Universe by Trent Dalton, a Brisbane author whose Boy Swallows Universe was a hit in Australia. And Trent Dalton, I guess, is known. He's been on talk shows or whatever in Australia. And it turns out, when you look down at the bio note, that Amelia Lester is an Australian writer living in Japan. So... And she refers to the author as if we're supposed to know his biography. She talks about his life, almost indistinguishable from his book. There's one paragraph in particular. Dalton is a celebrated magazine journalist in Australia known for his lyrical prose, so it comes as a shock to learn of sometimes brutal circumstances in which he was raised. This coming of age, she's referring to Dalton, to Trent Dalton, the author of the book. But the next sentence is, this coming of age story begins in 1985 and ends a few years later with Eli's budding career as a newspaper reporter. But Eli is a character in the book, Boy Swallows Universe. It's directly elided. They are blurred together. The first sentence is that it comes as a shock to learn that Trent Dalton had the brutal circumstances under which he was raised. This coming-of-age story begins in 1985. This coming-of-age story, the very beginning of the very next sentence, is not referring to Trent Dalton. It's referring to his character, his stand-in character, who Trent Dalton and his mother have both gone on press and said that the main character in the book is a blending, it's 50% autobiographical. And I don't care. And you shouldn't care either. And the author of this review obviously does care. And she cares at least in part because she is also Australian. Because she has been hip deep in the author's media appearances. The author's personality, which is far better known in Australia than it is in America, where 90% of the New York Times book review circulation is read. And again, I cannot help but think that this lineup, this matching of review and reviewer, was intentional. I've got a book that was a big hit in Australia. I better get an Australian reviewer to do it. That is a bad decision. That actually weakens the veracity of the review, in my opinion, because this review is for you. It's not for the author, and it's not for readers in Australia. It's for you. It's for you to determine whether or not this book is worth buying or reading. This is a very hyped book. And that makes it all the more important that a reviewer be square with the book and with the reader, with telling the reader the strengths and weaknesses of the book. And I read this review and didn't trust it in the least. And not just because I read Boy Swallows Universe and thought it was kind of bad. It wasn't just that. It wouldn't have mattered. My reaction to the book doesn't matter at all. What matters is the fact that the review announces that the author is a countryman of the author of the book undercut my belief in the review. The same thing is true with the next one. Naomi Novik reviews The Binding by Bridget Collins. Bridget Collins' fantasy novel, The Binding, is about magic that is derived from books. And The review is extremely well written. The Naomi Novik did a great series. The His Majesty's Dragon series, the Tamerlane books are fantastic. And the review starts out, of course, books don't need to be turned into magical artifacts. They already are. That's fantastic. That's just fantastic. But Naomi Novik's new book is about transforming gold or silver into gold. It's about a young mage who can work alchemy in the real world. And you can see already the binding is about magic that is worked from books. Those are extremely similar. It is extremely similar. And Naomi Novik's new book is out in hardcover in bookstores now, right alongside the binding. Same table, same section, different publishers, same price point, meaning too expensive, meaning they're each $30, meaning that a great number of people who see them on that new release table are only going to be able to afford one. Now, I got some grief from some of you last time when I said that one of the reasons that I don't like this process of matching reviewer to author is that sometimes it's too close. Sometimes you are, in effect, giving the review of a book to someone who is writing a competing book. And I got a little crap for that, and maybe it deserves a little crap like that. But in a case like this, it's 1-to-1. These two, Naomi Novik has been at this a lot longer, but it doesn't matter. They are writing the exact same kind of book in the exact same kind of genre in the exact same time in the exact same bookstores. So I'm not saying that Naomi Novik it's a positive review. So I'm not saying that she's trying to tear down a rival. I'm saying it introduces a fatal element of doubt into the review. Because I'm wondering, if the review is positive, I'm wondering, was it because you're trying to help out the same team? Same side, you feel a comradeship, maybe you've been on a book panel or two with this person, you're perfectly willing to overlook in order to sell? Or, if it were a negative review, well, I don't trust it if it's negative, because you're tearing out a rival, someone who has a book right next to yours on a table for plenty of customers who can afford only one. And you're in a perfect position to say, by implication, you should buy mine. And the same thing is true with this next one, a full-page spread of where Greg Jackson reviews Revolutionaries by Joshua First. Greg Jackson is the author of Prodigals, which was a hugely praised debut novel. And Revolutionaries, I think, is Joshua First's second book. But they are both... aside from a few details here and there, they are the same writer. Roughly the same age, roughly the same background, the same array of publication credits and grants and workshops. In one case, the MacDowell Colony, in the other case, the Iowa Writers Workshop. They're effectively the same author. Now, they might not have competing books in stores right now, but it still raises that element of doubt because the Times keeps doing this. It raises the element of doubt because do they know each other? Does Greg Jackson feel an extra amount of sympathy for Joshua First because he's been there, because he wants to be there? It's too close. It's too close for comfort. What I want the Times to do is stop doing this. Just stop doing this. Cultivate an entire card catalog of reviewers who don't have a dog in the race. Instead of constantly going for these status gets, don't do that. Unless it's a huge thing. Walter Isaacson, of course, doesn't have anything to worry about from anybody. Doesn't have to compete with anybody. He's one of the greatest biographers alive today. So if you can get him to write a review of a new biography, go ahead and do it. But the rest of this, down in the weeds like this, when those things matter, stop doing it. Stop doing it. Instead of finding an Australian to review a book by an Australian, find an associate English professor somewhere in the American Midwest to do it, who won't have a dog in the race, who won't know Trent Dalton from a hole in the wall, and might make a more trustworthy review. I'm not saying that Amelia Lester's review is not trustworthy. I'm saying that Caesar's Wife must be above reproach, and reproach is all over these reviews. if I can see it. Well, anyway, the next one is the other review that I wrote myself. They got Andrew Basovich to do a review of Leap of Faith, which is Michael Mazar's new book on George W. Bush taking the nation to war in Iraq. And it's a frustrating book, an infuriating book, and I reviewed it at length for The National on the other side of the world. And I don't think my review is run yet. So I went into Basovich is a fantastic writer, and I've reviewed him in the past. And I went into this thinking, oh God, there's always that butterfly stomach feeling, because you're wondering, okay, Is this reviewer going to find something that you missed? Are they going to make a better point than you do? I am resigned to the fact that most of them write better than I do, but that's a very different thing from whether or not they read better than I do. You don't want to read. I launched into this thing with butterflies because I wasn't sure what he would make of the book. The book is a kind of apology for the thinking that got the United States into the Iraq War, and that simply will not fly. That simply is not a tenable position. The Iraq War, well, I was pleased to see that Bacevich has the same ideas about the book that I did, that I filed weeks ago. So that was great. That was a relief. He says, to explain all of this in terms of misplaced messianic impulse, the self-described indispensable nation having a bad run of luck may play well in Washington, where serious introspection is rarely welcome. Yet ultimately, such an explanation amounts to little more than a dodge. After all, altruism rarely, if ever, provides an adequate explanation for the actions of a great power. The United States invaded Iraq not in response to a vigorous missionary impulse, but to avoid reckoning with this fact. Decades of wrong-headed policies in the Middle East had culminated on 9/11 in a cataclysmic episode of blowback. He refers to it in his, I don't agree with that last point, but he refers to very well in this review that the Iraq War was not a miscalculation, but rather a fraud, a crime. And that is the one of the two direct connections that I had in this issue. I reviewed Our Man for Open Letters. Didn't have to wait, no lag time, no nothing like that. It's a classic payoff. With Open Letters, I write it, I file it with my site manager, and then it runs in very short order. I'm not waiting weeks to see it. And the payoff is I don't get paid. But I do get into the conversation. I'm on as many book paperbacks blurbed as Andrew Bacevich will be in the summer. I guarantee you, when a new raft of paperbacks comes out, I'll be well represented. So I'm willing to take that trade-off when I need to write about a book. Then Mark Epstein reviews David Brooks's new book, The Second Mountain. David Brooks is a New York Times columnist, and The Second Mountain is a strange book. I would almost say a religious book, except it isn't explicitly religious. But it's very, very good. It's very good. I usually don't agree with Brooks about much, but this is a book about the first mountain in his figure of speech here is all of the stuff, the job, the family, the paycheck, the raise, the renown of the world, that sort of thing. In his view, the second mountain is more important to climb, and it's all the non-stuff. It's love and be loved. It's cherished. It's, are you doing something worthwhile? Is your heart full? I don't know. I guess my stereotypical view of a New York Times columnist, I wouldn't have expected him to ever have any kind of breakthrough like that. And instead, this book, it was wonderful. I thought it was wonderful. And so did Mark Epstein. He also gives it a good review. And then we jump to the whole inside is we go back to Walter Isaacson writing about Dick Holbrook. And it's amazing. It's really, really good. I wanted to read you. Here we go. When Barack Obama was elected president, Holbrook again lobbied hard to become Secretary of State. But the incoming president became allergic to him. Obama, who took as much pride in telling people he hadn't read their books as Holbrook did in saying that he had, was disdainful of Holbrook's compulsion to flatter and to be flattered. When the president called him Dick at their first meeting, Holbrook stopped him and, as Martin has instructed him to do, he asked the president, Martin was his lover at the time, instructed the president to call him Richard instead. And the quote from Packer's book is, if Holbrook had tried to repel him on their first minute together, he couldn't have done a better job. That review goes on for a whole page and then half of another page. And the half of the following page is Mitch Zukof's great book, Fall and Rise, about 9/11, which has, it's Clyde Haberman, who is a former columnist for the Times, starts off his review by saying this book is painful to read, and that's a bit of a wincer of an opening line, because he's praising the book. He's just saying the subject is painful, but still you could read. Authors live in terror of opening the New York Times book review and seeing a review of their book that starts with this book is painful to read. But it doesn't mean it in that way. I was hoping, I had all sorts of rumors, all sorts of back and forth conflicting stories. I was really hoping that Mitch Zukof's book would have been the cover of the book review, and here it's half of one page. That's a little disappointing. 500 words for what I consider to be a book every bit as good as Our Man. But it's a positive review, so that's good. And then we wrap up. There's a children's book section where they spring for color. There's the bestseller list. The only thing of note is they finish off. Tina Jordan does a column called Inside the List, where she tells little stories about things that are on the bestseller list. And in this particular instance, she starts with a new entry at number 10, Machines Like Us by Ian McEwan, because she wants to recount the huge flap that happened when he was interviewed and disdained science fiction and disdained the very idea that he was writing science fiction. And keep in mind, I've been criticizing genre carpetbaggers like him and Margaret Atwood for 40 years, people who poach from the legitimate and genre of science fiction that brilliant writers have written in, and then disdain it as they leave town. And she recites the disdainful quotes that he made, and then she recounts the controversy. The sci-fi community began calling out McEwan's genre snobbery on Twitter and in opinion pieces. Quote, "It is absurd for McEwan to claim he's not writing sci-fi, as it is for him to imply that sci-fi is incapable of approaching these themes interestingly," said one critic. Quote, alternative history and non-human consciousness are established sci-fi motifs. Another critic wrote, "Anyone is entitled to try out ideas. What you can't do is write a detective story and think, quote, the butler did it is a world-class clever twist." Dwight Garner noted in his review of Machines Like Me, people are touchy about genre. Again, the snobbery comes creeping in, and you're about to get a double blast of it. Kurt Vonnegut famously complained that he was, quote, a sore-headed occupant of a file drawer labeled science fiction, and I would like out, particularly since so many serious critics regularly mistake the drawer for a urinal. And notice he's saying he wants out of the drawer rather than he wants the critics to wise up. Classic Kurt Vonnegut. And Harlan Ellison, of late and sainted memory, once said, quote, "Call me a science fiction writer. I'll come to your house and I'll nail your pet's head to the coffee table. I'll hit you so hard your ancestors will die." And yet he wrote science fiction his whole career. So and these two are quoted. It bugged me a little that those two were quoted because they seemed to be, the alignment of the quotes seemed to be supporting McEwan's snobbery. Here are two other writers who also didn't like being called science fiction writers. When, you could name a couple of other writers who loved being called science fiction writers and who were much better writers than either Kurt Vonnegut or Ian McEwan. Harlan Ellison is one of those writers, but he's always been a weird case. But try telling Kate Wilhelm that you're only a science fiction writer. Try saying that to Ursula Le Guin. Anyway, that was the New York Times Book Review for the week that was. This was my second try at the New York Times Book Review with one grizzly bear diversion into the op-ed panel. So once again, I want to know, these are long videos. Of course, these are going to be long videos. This is the Bible, my Bible that I'm reading from. But, of course, I want to know, if this is just too booky even for you. If it is, I'll stop. But otherwise, I love it. So I'm gonna wrap this up hideously long. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.